Hi, everyone. I'm Nate Boot. I'm a developer advocate for OpenSearch. I'm here with Jonah Kowall to my right, camera left, and Derek Ho to my left, camera right. We're here to talk about tracing at the lovely RAI Convention Center. We've got a great spot here to have a quick conversation about Jaeger Tracing and how the tracing of applications has evolved over the years. And I think we're going to have a pretty good conversation because we've got two great experts here to tell us all about it. Thanks, guys. Do you want to introduce yourself, Jonah?
Yeah, definitely. My name's Jonah Kowall. I'm the VP of Product Management at Aiven, an open source data platform and data streaming company. And I also work on Jaeger, which is why I'm here at the conference. I did the maintainer talk for the Jaeger project and just really enjoy contributing and working on open source. And also a big OpenSearch fan and part of the community. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Appreciate that. Derek, tell us all about yourself.
Yeah, I'm a software engineer at the OpenSearch Project, and I work on the Observability plugin and the Trace Analytics feature.
Well, it sounds like we've picked the right two people to come have a talk about application tracing. So, my understanding is that, over the last decade or two, microservices has become much more popular, much more ubiquitous, as our architectures are becoming more pieced together with smaller and smaller fundamental functions. We need ways to trace those things, and it sounds like you've got a great solution with Jaeger. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution and what anything notable about the last decade or so?
Yeah, definitely. So APM and tracing have been around for a long time. But as you mentioned, with the advent of more and more microservices, Uber found it very difficult to actually get visibility into their architecture. And so they, in fact, built Jaeger for internal uses. And Uber, as a big advocate of open source at the time, open sourced the project. It got a lot of interest. And then they donated it to the CNCF. And it is one of the first graduated projects of the CNCF. So it's very stable. It's been around for quite some time, and it's widely adopted. So when people are working on open source and doing work in tracing, you tend to see the Jaeger UI and Jaeger used. It's very popular. So
nice.
Yeah.
But it feels good to have projects like that donated to a foundation where they can be curated and kind of maintained with a lot of trust from the public. So I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Derek, from your perspective, was there anything specific about the evolution of microservices that made you interested in Jaeger, or does your position as working on the trace analytics for OpenSearch just kind of naturally make you interested in this kind of thing?
Definitely. I think just being interested in this observability space in general, I think tracing is a very key part of modern day applications, like understanding where problems occur, where slowdowns occur. And I think Jaeger is a very mature product to be able to do that.
Wonderful. Yeah, I keep hearing this buzzword Web 3.0, and it makes me think of, back in the 2000s when I first learned of the XML HTTP requests. Ajax became very popular, and that was a dawn of these static websites where little calls could be made and then repopulating your page with stuff. And so rather than filling content with those kinds of calls, it turns out you're making traces with Jaeger. Now, has that been successful? You're having a lot of success with Jaeger, and
Sure.
On the other end of that, were there any troubles to adopting it, or were there any dysfunctions that you had to overcome? Like, what do you think the biggest hurdles were?
Yeah. So when you look at tracing, although it is the most mature part of OpenTelemetry, which the goal of OpenTelemetry is to bring together logs, metrics, and traces. Traces is the most mature part of it, but traces is also the hardest part to implement. So the challenge that you run into is that everyone wants tracing, but they usually start with metrics and logs. And so the adoption of tracing is always lower. However, the value to a developer of having the context of the trace and where things are going in between their different services is highly valuable. So as soon as a developer sees tracing, they're like, I want more of that. This is what I need. And so the value is there, but the implementation is not always so easy. And with auto instrumentation and open telemetry, we're trying to make it easier and more automatic so that people can just get started with it. And that's a big goal for the project. And open telemetry is the second most active project in the CNCF behind Kubernetes. So it's extremely active. There's a huge number of contributors across hundreds of companies and hundreds of end users. Jaeger, we have a much smaller community. We have fewer contributors because it's so stable and it's been around for quite some time, but open telemetry is still really like growing and becoming that standard. So Jaeger and open telemetry are very bonded to one another. And the main reason why is that we open telemetry collector, the main component, is actually a fork that was the Jaeger collector.
Oh, okay.
And eventually we're going to fold it back into Jaeger. But the two projects are very linked to one another just because of a lot of the shared code base and the shared concepts
Sure.
that Jaeger created, and the creator of Jaeger, Yuri at Uber, created that a lot of these concepts that are now part of open telemetry.
Well, thank you, Yuri at Uber. We appreciate it.
And he's also our main maintainer and kind of guides the project as
Wonderful.
well. So.
Well, cool. So you mentioned something interesting there. You said you had fewer contributors because it's so stable.
Yep.
Is that a common thing for the contributor count to dwindle as you have less bugs, or kind of an aside? But I'm curious now that you mentioned it.
We kind of have the basic feature set for tracing. One of the things that we introduced over the last couple of years was probably the biggest new feature of Jaeger in the last maybe 3 or 4 years was the ability to tie metrics to traces and visualize, basically allow you to do monitoring off the tracing data. So tracing itself is really designed for diagnostics, and Jaeger is a diagnostic tool.
Okay.
We've now added in some parts of doing monitoring by using metrics and deriving metrics from traces. And so with Jaeger, we've made it a little bit more monitoring. It's nowhere near as sophisticated as what you can do with OpenSearch and Prometheus, but it definitely is evolving, as a platform.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So do either of you anticipate any kind of hurdles to adoption? Was there a big, I know with OpenSearch, when you get started, or with lots of other technologies, sometimes there's a lot of corollary technologies that you have to learn, such, I had to learn about Docker when I started with OpenSearch.
Sure.
And then, you get involved in open source technology, you have to learn a little bit about Git. And so there's a lot of these secondary things that are they overlap, were there any of those that were notable to either of you?
Yeah, sure. So I think one big hurdle that people may face when they're first getting started with tracing, especially if they're working with a lot of data, is sampling. Traces can be generated at an extremely high rate on most modern day applications, hundreds of thousands of spans per second, or terabytes a day sometimes. So kind of fine tuning the sampling on that. Technically, there's some challenges with just simply not dropping spans in transit between the agent and your collector, or between the client and the agent as well. So I think there's a lot of thinking that has to go into where do you place the agent, how do you make sure that you're getting the spans that you want and sampling it so that it's a cost effective.
And a lot of that in the Jaeger open telemetry world is quite mature. There's been a lot of advancements around sampling and scaling and handling some of those issues. And the nice part is that in Jaeger, we used to have our own instrumentation and data collection. Now we use open telemetry, which has a huge community. So it actually allows us to have way more capabilities to deal with sampling than we used to have with the Jaeger instrumentation SDKs and APIs. So with open telemetry, there's great resources that you can go to get help on scaling and sampling and dealing with some of these challenges. So it's a much bigger and broader community than it was even just 2 or 3 years ago. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So speaking of things not so far in the distant past, you were talking about potentially terabytes of trace data per day. If it were 20 years ago, do you think such a solution would even be possible or needed?
I mean, Uber always has had a huge volume of microservices transactions and a huge volume, and they've always done sampling. And they actually created certain parts of Jaeger that allow you to do dynamic sampling. So you can actually change the sampling rate on the fly within the application. So, for example, if you're dealing with an issue, you can actually say, oh, I want to start capturing more traces on this set of services. So they built a lot of sophisticated tooling that now, we've seen adopted throughout tracing that really lets you do more sophisticated kinds of sampling.
Excellent.
So it's always a problem because data costs money and you've got to figure out how to keep enough of it, but not too much.
Yeah.
Logs have the same issue. I mean, same problem as traces. They're just high volumes of data and it's hard to deal with it.
Yeah, so I have to date myself a little bit here. If it were 20, 30 years ago and someone said, oh, we'll have to have a terabyte of trace logs in a day, my jaw would have hit the floor. I remember coughing up $250 for a 500 gigabyte hard drive
for sure
back in the day. So that's interesting. So that really does kind of show the evolution of how much data microservices are having to deal with and the scale that some companies are using them at. So it seems like tracing has become central to the whole pillars of observability. And you guys mentioned something earlier about how you started correlating logs and metrics and traces. So there's those three pillars of it.
Yeah.
So in addition to trace analytics, you're talking about combining those three pillars of observability with Jaeger, where you correlate logs and metrics and traces. Well, is that the ultimate goal, or has it been doing that the whole time?
Yeah. So, I mean, in Jaeger, we've just introduced some metrics that are derived from traces. The challenge that we hear, and I probably heard it 5 or 6 times from users at KubeCon, is that they don't like the fact that Jaeger's a tracing tool. And then they have to go to Grafana for metrics. And then they have to go to something like OpenSearch for logs. And I explained to them that, well, now you can start to analyze more of your data in OpenSearch because your same Jaeger schema, and even if you like the Jaeger UI, you can also use trace analytics. So I've told that to several users where you can start to do logging and tracing together. Metrics, however, I know is still kind of a work in progress with OpenSearch. So people still often use something like Grafana with Prometheus is kind of the common pattern. And Prometheus is another graduated CNCF project. And obviously it's very popular and well adopted. So I think the goal is really to bring these things together, and it makes sense that OpenSearch is doing it. I don't see us in Jaeger trying to build something like that. We're a tracing tool. That's what we do. We know users need more stuff.
Right.
OpenTelemetry is designed to do the correlation. That's the purpose of having that single collector, is that when you send logs and metrics and traces together, they're actually correlated and tagged together. And so the idea is when they go into these systems, then you have the right signals to connect things together.
Interesting.
And that's the purpose of the project, is really to try to make that ubiquitous and standardized.
Huh. Well, it's interesting because we had a conversation about Nginx and some of the integrations that have happened by kind of combining schemas so that the signals coming in from OpenTelemetry kind of have a common format. They kind of get manipulated. And so despite having multiple sources of signals and telemetry, you end up with a common visualization for all of them because they all have a common mapping.
That's the goal. It usually works, but not always. It usually works in your code. The problem is when you start bringing in other components.
Sure.
We get a lot of questions about service mesh with Jaeger, and people don't really understand that when you try to do tracing on the infrastructure layer, you're not going to have the application context.
Right.
You really need to see it from the code. That's how the traces get propagated and defined. They need to see the code executing. And that's the challenge. People would like to get it from other ways, but you need to look at the code. That's really, there's no shortcut. So.
Interesting. Do you have a unique take on that, Derek?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I think in a lot of RCA situations, it may be hard to create alerts based on tracing. So I think, as Jonah mentioned, like a common pattern may be to create an alert based on metrics.
Yep.
and then have like the developer or the DevOps go from the metric into the specific trace or specific log to learn more about what caused
Right.
that metric alert to go off. And I think it's really important to have correlation between the metrics and the traces and the logs so that you don't lose that context.
Yep.
So I think a really interesting thing that's coming up is like exemplars and better exemplar support for metrics and traces is just like in OpenSearch dashboards, adding that point in metrics where you can just like click directly into it and inspect the trace that caused that metric to go off.
Yeah, definitely. Exemplars are a big addition to the Prometheus community, and it's definitely getting more widely adopted. But you don't always, I agree that metrics are the general path, and that's obviously the way that Grafana works, is that you usually start with a metric, but sometimes you want to start with a trace, and there are good reasons and use cases for that, or a log. So you don't always want to force the user to go down that path, even though it's a common path. Sometimes you want to start with a log, sometimes you want to start with a trace, and a lot of the times you start with a metric. So
Interesting. So
Yeah.
instead of drilling down
yeah,
from metrics to logs, you kind of drill back up from logs to metrics, or
Yep,
whatever whatever the user needs to get to their the info that they need.
yeah, and that's the nice thing with OpenSearch is because it indexes everything. It's easy to pivot that way. Some of the lower cost databases that don't index data, you can't start with a log. So there's trade-offs always depending
Right.
on the database, the data store, and
Yeah, and the
You know,
searchability of
exactly.
it once you're
Yeah.
done putting your data in.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you're really using Jaeger to kind of unlock other signals like traces and metrics. Then it's kind of a turnkey to getting those. Do you think people will have better insight into the problems they're having, or do you think they'll be capable of just finding more problems that they're having, or maybe a little bit of both?
I would say both.
Yeah, I mean, it can help with things like performance tuning and really making sure that things are as efficient as possible, finding certain patterns that are inefficient in the code, like doing recursive calls or calling a database multiple times. You can see that in a trace.
Right.
You don't necessarily see it in your running code because you're like, it runs fast on my laptop, it works in production.
Works on my machine.
But then you look at the trace and you're like, why is it doing all this extra stuff? Oh, I can just clean up the code. And now it's far more efficient, less code, less wasted CPU, greener planet, all of the stuff that comes with it,
dogs and cats living together.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time. Do you have any do's or don'ts, or do you have any advice or, hard lessons learned, things to avoid?
Yeah, definitely. I think one big thing is like people think that they need to adopt tracing right away for like everything. But if you're starting with an application that's like years, decades old even, you can derive quite a lot of value from just implementing tracing on like one specific path where you have like a lot of business value coming from that path, like checkout, for example, and then like kind of like going from there and for the rest of your application.
Yeah, and then also auto instrumentation is really key. It's supported on a lot of languages, and there are more and more coming all the time. So auto instrumentation is the easiest way to enter tracing, and it's definitely a big area of investment for open telemetry.
So what does your own internal magic 8-ball tell you about the future of distributed tracing?
Sure.
It's hard to tell the future about things, but if you could suggest something for people to plan towards, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so tracing is pretty stable in terms of open telemetry and as a signal. However, the next thing that the community is really working hard on is profiling. So when you look at commercial tools, tracing is great, but then when I found the problem, I want to get the depth. And so that's where profiling comes into play.
I see.
So profiling is kind of the next part of tracing or the next part of observability that's early stage. There's some nice projects out there and some really good tooling, and that'll hopefully be folded in as kind of the fourth signal of observability. But there's a lot of other areas that are being explored and of interest. Security is another area where we're trying to fold more of that type of data into observability. Now you see security companies talking about observability in the context of security. So it's, these worlds are coming together, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of interesting things going on.
They want traces too. They
Yes,
gotta track
sure.
those.
Yeah.
Awesome. So what about you? Do you think, can you recommend something for people to prep themselves? Is there technology we should start studying if we want to get into distributed tracing?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I see kind of like two major areas where tracing is moving towards, and that's like cost and correlation. So I think cost is a big thing that's on people's minds, and getting that down at OpenSearch at the observability plugin. We're working on storing your traces in S3 and then only materializing the index on the traces when, for example, an anomaly goes off or you get an alert. So I think that can be something that people can look out for that's coming up that can help with the cost. And with the correlation aspect, I think people should be on the lookout for exemplars and just getting better support with traces in their other pillars of observability.
So I've heard exemplars a couple of times in this conversation, and a couple of people have come to the booth saying, "Oh, I use exemplars."
Yeah.
It's a new technology to me, so I think it sounds like that's one thing we can plan for, is getting used to that one. And
Yeah, it's been in Prometheus for a couple years now. But yeah, people are starting to adopt it more and more. Yeah, it just definitely helps with logs and traces.
awesome. Is that something you had to study to kind of get started?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate both of your time. Jonah, thanks for coming
Sure.
out and spending
My
some
pleasure.
time with us. Derek,
Thank
appreciate
you.
your time.
Yep.
I think that's it for us. Thanks for joining us, and make sure to look out for these two friendly fellas at the OpenSearch booth at the Amsterdam Convention Center.